The summer of 1893 had pressed down hard on the western slope of Colorado. In the small farming town of Delta, the heat of an early September morning had driven most decent folk indoors or into whatever shade the buildings along Main Street could offer. It was, by every outward appearance, a morning like any other. Quiet, unhurried, the kind of morning that a small town earns after years of honest labor and neighborly living. It would not remain that way. Somewhere near 11:15, two men walked through the front door of the Farmers and Merchants Bank with firearms drawn and intention written plainly on their faces. They were Bill McCarty and his son Fred, members of an outlaw family that had been working the wrong side of the law since the days when the West was still finding its shape. Behind the bank, in the alley, a third man waited on horseback with the animals. That was Tom McCarty, Bill's brother, Fred's uncle, a man who had ridden long enough with outlaws to know that the horses were always the most important thing. Inside the bank, Bill ordered the cashier, a man named Andrew Blackley, and his assistant to raise their hands and hold themselves still. Fred moved to clear the partition and get behind the counter where the money was kept. What happened next took only seconds, as such things always do. Blackley, startled by the sudden violence of the moment, made some movement toward the counter beneath him. Whether he was reaching for a weapon or simply reacting from instinct, no man living could say with certainty afterward. Fred McCarty did not wait to find out. He fired twice at a distance that left no room for error. The first shot went wide. The second did not. Andrew Blackley was dead before he could draw another breath, killed in the place where he had spent his working days in honest service. Fred came over the counter, stuffed what currency he could find into a sack he carried beneath his shirt, and took up a bag of coins as well. The sound of the shots had already reached the street outside. Townsfolk were pressing at the front door, drawn by alarm and the instinct of a community that looked after its own. The robbers took Blackley's assistant as a shield and went out the back way into the alley. Tom McCarty was there, mounted and holding the horses, a gun leveled at a lawyer who worked in the adjoining building. As Fred swung up into his saddle, the bag of coins fell from his grasp and struck the ground. There was no time to recover it. The noise from the street was growing. The McCartys released their hostage and spurred their horses hard to the north, riding the alley as though the earth itself were closing behind them. They very nearly made it. Across Main Street, a hardware merchant by the name of Ray Simpson heard the commotion and did not hesitate. He came out of his establishment with a Sharps rifle in hand, a single-shot weapon, the kind that rewarded patience and punished haste, and moved toward the sound of trouble at a run. As he crossed the street, he saw three riders roughly a block distant, where the alley met the crossing of 3rd Street. The riders saw him too, and they fired. Simpson did not flinch. He took his aim at the last man in the group and discharged his rifle. The shot found Bill McCarty with a precision that left no ambiguity about its result. The man was dead in an instant. His body remained in the saddle for a few surreal seconds before it pitched forward and fell into the dust of the alley, lifeless. Simpson was already moving again, reloading his single-shot rifle as he ran toward what had just fallen. Fred McCarty, who had been only yards from the open country beyond town, had pulled up at the end of the alley to look back at his father. That hesitation, that moment of a son unwilling to leave his father behind, cost him everything. Simpson stopped, raised his rifle a second time, and fired across a distance that witnesses would later estimate at better than 100 yards. Fred McCarty fell from his horse and did not rise. He was dead before the ground received him. Tom McCarty, riding ahead of his nephew, was already shouting for the young man to follow when the second shot was fired. He drove his spurs in and ran. Simpson's third shot, the one meant for Tom, missed its mark, though it found the horse's hindquarter and drew blood. The wounded animal carried its rider forward regardless, out of town, into the open land beyond, and out of Delta's reckoning forever. The McCarty gang, such as it was, ceased to exist in that alley on the morning of September 7, 1893. What remained behind told its own story. The Farmers and Merchants Bank had lost not a single coin. The drop bag saw to that. Andrew Blackley, the man who had died for no greater offense than showing up to his post that morning, left behind a wife and 8 sons, the youngest not yet a year old, the eldest barely 15. That woman, by some measure of strength that defies simple accounting, saw every one of those boys educated at the college level. What she carried in the years following her husband's death was a weight that no record fully captures. The bodies of Bill and Fred McCarty were laid out for public viewing, as was the custom of the era, and photographed. The images sold in town for 25 cents apiece. The 2 men were buried together, by most accounts in a single box, in the section of the Delta Cemetery reserved for those who died without sufficient standing or sufficient mourners to warrant better. Tom McCarty lived on, though living may be too generous a word for what followed. He drifted through the remaining years of the century among the company of other men whose names appeared on the wrong kind of paper, and eventually found his way back to the country of his origins in the far northeastern corner of Oregon. He worked ordinary occupations, roads, local governance, the quiet administration of a county's smaller functions. By 1917, he had vanished entirely, leaving behind no word of explanation or destination. Those who had known him heard nothing further. Ray Simpson, the hardware merchant who had ended the McCarty gang with 2 shots from a single-shot rifle, received the recognition that such an act warranted. Newspapers across the country told his story. And then the letters began to arrive, written in Tom McCarty's hand, carrying threats that made plain the old outlaw had not forgotten who had killed his brother and his nephew in that Delta alley. Simpson left his home and relocated far from Colorado, leaving no address behind. It was not enough. His wife, undone by the years of threat and uncertainty, lost herself entirely to the strain of it and spent the remainder of her life under institutional care. Simpson himself lived until 1940, carrying with him the particular burden of a man who had done right by his town and paid for it in ways that no newspaper account ever fully recorded. The morning had begun, like any other in Delta, Colorado. It did not end that way. And for those whose lives it touched, the widow behind the bank counter, the outlaw riding wounded into open country, the merchant who had stepped into the street with a rifle, it never truly ended at all.